Welcome to The Debate. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating and, frankly, quite challenging intellectual framework, the three phases of societal evolution. Now, this model, it proposes that all societies progress through these distinct stages: rise, decline, and ultimately collapse. Each phase, according to the framework, it's defined by specific shifts in, well, how power is exercised, how leaders interact with their people, and the core societal focus. So you move from widespread consent and unity in the rise phase to deception and a preoccupation with stability in the decline, and then finally to outright coercion and really just a sole focus on survival during collapse. Now, the framework's author doesn't just stop at theory. They make these 5 bold predictions specifically for the Western world, arguing that we are right now on the cusp of, or perhaps already deep within, the decline or even collapse phase. So our essential question for this discussion is pretty precise. Does this predictive model for the West, with its specific 5 bold predictions, actually offer a credible, a robust framework for truly understanding our current societal trajectories? I'll be arguing for the model's powerful explanatory and predictive capabilities, demonstrating how its identified characteristics of decline align quite compellingly with the West's current path.
And I'll be taking the other side, challenging that direct and perhaps I'd say overly confident application to the Western world. Look, while the framework provides a valuable conceptual lens, no doubt, I want to scrutinize the implied inevitability of these 5 bold predictions. I think they might involve some, well, significant oversimplifications or perhaps lack the nuanced evidence required to draw such definitive, such immediate conclusions about our complex modern societies. My focus will be on whether the West truly fits the model's more, let's say, extreme interpretations of decline and collapse, or if maybe there's a more resilient and adaptive story still playing out.
Okay, so the 3 phases of societal evolution, it's important to remember, isn't really about moral judgments or, what society should be. It tries to offer this dispassionate, analytical lens, focusing on understanding the underlying power structures and how they influence behavior. That's its real strength, I think. And from this perspective, the West, and I'm thinking particularly of the US and Europe, displays some, undeniable signs of transitioning into that decline phase. We observe a pretty clear shift where bureaucracy increasingly prioritizes self-preservation, protecting its own status over genuine innovation or even public service. Leaders, rather than truly persuading, often resort to deception. The framework's author uses a really pointed analogy here. The McDonald's has free hamburgers example. It illustrates how leaders might offer these superficially attractive but ultimately empty promises or distractions to maintain support or, quell dissent, rather than engaging with the substantive issues. This, I think, indicates a prevailing focus on maintaining the status quo, on stability at all costs, rather than pursuing growth or reform or a genuine societal improvement, which, inevitably, it leads to stagnation. Now, these observed shifts aren't just isolated incidents. They directly inform the framework's 5 bold predictions. Take, for instance, the decline of democracy and freedom. That isn't some future threat. It seems evident now in the gradual erosion of individual liberties and the increasing normalization of, let's say, strong-arm tactics, even the use of military-style solutions for domestic problems. We saw glimpses of this with tactics employed by various administrations responding to civil unrest. Similarly, the prediction of economic collapse stems from a really palpable disillusionment with the existing system, leading to decreased productivity, a significant decline in public trust, and a kind of withdrawal from active participation. The model's merit, as its proponent says, is really in whether its predictions align with reality, and my assessment is that the evidence, sadly, suggests a strong correlation.
I agree that the framework itself, the 3 phases, provides a fascinating conceptual architecture for understanding these broad patterns of societal change, and it certainly provokes critical thought. I won't argue with that. However, its direct and immediate application to the Western world, and particularly that sense of inevitability conveyed by the 5 bold predictions, that really warrants closer scrutiny, I feel. The framework itself, it describes the decline phase as not fully collapsing. That suggests to me a prolonged period where a society is, quote, no longer improving, but isn't necessarily in an immediate freefall. And that distinction is, I think, crucial. Can we confidently say that characteristics like bureaucracy and political deception, which, yes, are present in varying degrees across many complex societies, perhaps always have been, are they unique indicators of an imminent societal collapse? Or are they rather persistent, maybe even endemic, challenges that societies constantly navigate? The source material itself emphasizes that societies tend to rise quickly but decline slowly, very slowly, potentially. This implies a far longer, more gradual process than the rapid and dramatic outcomes some of these predictions suggest. Furthermore, I find that the causal links drawn between these general characteristics of decline and the specific, quite dramatic predictions like mass immigration directly leading to violent civil conflict or foreign wars primarily serving to avoid domestic revolution, well, they might oversimplify the incredibly intricate interplay of social, economic, and geopolitical factors at play in contemporary Western nations. This framework, while insightful, I worry might not fully account for the demonstrable resilience, the adaptive capacities, and the, diverse responses possible within established democracies, which have historically mitigated or altered these kinds of predicted trajectories before.
I see why you emphasize the gradual nature and the potential for resilience, but let's dive into the evidentiary basis for the West's current position a bit more deeply. The evidence for entry into the decline phases is, in my view, pretty robust and aligns quite directly with the framework's definitions. Let's consider bureaucracy emerges. This isn't just about, inefficiency or red tape. It's about systems and individuals prioritizing protecting their own status above all else. In the rise phase, the emphasis is on utility, on progress. In decline, it shifts decisively to self-preservation of the apparatus itself. And we see this manifested in a stifling of innovation, where complex rules and procedures become ends in themselves rather than means to an end. Moreover, that transition from consent and cooperation to deception replaces consent is, I think, absolutely critical. Leaders manipulate narratives. They manipulate information rather than genuinely persuading the populace. The free hamburgers analogy isn't just about empty promises. It's about a deliberate obfuscation of reality to maintain control, masking potentially authoritarian tendencies as mere suggestion or, for the public good. This isn't just a cyclical blip. It feels like a foundational shift that inevitably leads to the kind of stagnation we're witnessing. And the decline of democracy and freedom, it's stark. We've observed the increasing use of military solutions for domestic problems, and I agree it's not just one administration, it seems like a trend, blurring the lines between law enforcement and military force when responding to internal dissent. This isn't just politics as usual, it's a profound move away from democratic principles towards a more coercive internal control. It signals a deep structural decay. So how do you reconcile these tangible shifts with the idea that we're merely facing, persistent but manageable challenges? What qualitative difference are you looking for to signal a true phase transition?
That's a compelling portrayal of the current challenges, and I absolutely agree that bureaucracy and instances of political manipulation are undeniable. They exist. However, I still question whether these truly represent a definitive phase transition into decline, as opposed to, recurrent issues that complex societies, particularly large nation-states, continually confront and, importantly, often overcome. You've highlighted the move from consent to deception, and that's a strong point. But the rise phase, according to the same framework, is also characterized by openness, a free flow of ideas and open debate. Now, while these elements are undoubtedly challenged today, I'd argue they still exist quite significantly in the West. We still have a robust, if often, let's face it, contentious, public discourse. We have a critical press, sometimes overly critical perhaps, and mechanisms for accountability, however imperfect. So to claim a definitive shift to full deception might be premature. There's still a vibrant counter-narrative, there's still public scrutiny happening. Furthermore, the stagnation and the focus on stability mentioned in the decline phase description, they don't inherently equate to an immediate inevitable collapse.
The source itself states, and I'll repeat it because it's important, while not fully collapsing, the society is no longer improving. This suggests a prolonged state, maybe a kind of equilibrium, a holding pattern, rather than an immediate slide into civil conflict or authoritarian rule. My point is, the West has shown a historical capacity for reform and adaptation. We've faced corruption, economic stagnation, deep political polarization before, and we've navigated them, often through institutional self-correction and citizen engagement. What makes this current iteration of challenges so fundamentally different, so qualitatively distinct that it signals an irreversible phase transition rather than another difficult cycle we might eventually overcome? Okay, let's maybe pivot to the 5 bold predictions themselves, because this is where the framework makes its most dramatic claims for the Western world, and frankly, where I see the most significant potential for oversimplification. I find the direct and seemingly inevitable link drawn between mass immigration and civil conflict particularly problematic. The framework seems to posit this linear progression. Native populations resist displacement, violence. That just feels overly deterministic. It implies an almost automatic violent outcome, disregarding the extremely complex factors driving migration in the first place, the potential for integration over generations, which has happened repeatedly, or the diverse, often quite proactive, policy responses from governments and civil society aimed at managing demographic shifts. Are we truly suggesting that integration is impossible now, or that these other factors are suddenly irrelevant? Similarly, the prediction of pointless foreign wars driven solely by leaders choosing war or revolution, the idea of sending people off to war just to prevent domestic uprisings, while yes, it has historical precedents, it presents a rather reductionist view of modern geopolitical complexities. It suggests a singular, almost cynical motivation for international conflict, and it seems to overlook other multifaceted realities like economic interests, alliances, genuine humanitarian concerns, or real security threats. These predictions, while certainly provocative and worth thinking about, might lack the detailed, nuanced causal pathways one would expect from a truly robust predictive model for societies as complex and interconnected as ours.
I'm not convinced they're overly simplistic or reductionist once we understand them within the framework's broader context. See, the predictions aren't meant to be simple, A causes B, linear cause and effect statements. They're better understood, I think, as a description of a system under increasing multifaceted strain, where internal decay combines with inevitable external shocks. The framework explicitly states this, and it's really key that collapse is triggered not just by internal decay, but by external shocks that the system can no longer absorb. Things like war, pandemic, climate crisis, revolution, potentially all at once. So the 5 predictions, when you consider them together, they form a kind of self-reinforcing cycle of internal decay that increases vulnerability to precisely these shocks. So mass immigration isn't just people moving. In this specific context, it's presented as a symptom of decline, where governments may be unable to stimulate internal growth or maintain social cohesion, seek external replacements as local populations perhaps disengage or shrink. And this, yes, creates further internal friction and fragmentation, but within a society already weakened by deception and bureaucratic sclerosis. The philosophical note from the framework's author is crucial here too. The model is not about what should happen, but about what is happening. It focuses on identifying and predicting societal behavior based on these underlying power structures. The predictions, then, they serve as the critical test for the model's merit. And the observable trends, increasing societal fragmentation, widespread disillusionment, a palpable sense of internal division, these strongly support their likelihood as consequences of this identified decline. It's a systemic view, I think, not merely a linear one. And let me also just broaden our scope slightly to consider the universality versus specificity of this framework, because I believe the framework's core strength lies precisely in its ability to identify these universal patterns in societal evolution that seem to transcend specific political systems. The source itself offers, interestingly, 1950s America and China as examples of open societies that were both arguably in a rise phase, despite their fundamentally differing political structures. One a democracy, the other communist. This illustrates, I think, that the phases operate on deeper structural and maybe psychological levels.
They identify fundamental shifts in how power is exercised and how societies relate to their people, moving from consent to deception to coercion, rather than being tied to a particular ideology like democracy or communism.
And this universality makes it highly applicable, I'd argue, to the Western world. It suggests that even highly developed, seemingly robust societies like ours are subject to these underlying dynamics. The question, therefore, isn't really if the West is immune, but rather where does it currently sit within these universal, perhaps inexorable phases? Our democratic institutions, while incredibly valuable, may not provide an ultimate shield against these deeper structural shifts.
That's a very compelling argument for the framework's universal appeal, and I appreciate that point about transcending political systems. But I still believe we must be extremely cautious about applying universal historical patterns without adequately acknowledging the unique specificities of individual societies, especially societies as complex and, yes, historically resilient as Western nations. Yes, the framework identifies deep structural patterns. That's its value. But the manifestations and, crucially, the potential mitigation of these patterns can vary significantly.
Western nations, with their deeply established democratic institutions, their traditions of critical thinking, robust legal systems, and inherent mechanisms for self-correction, including that vibrant open debate which the source attributes to the rise phase in which I maintain still very much exists, well, they might exhibit different trajectories or at least different rates of change compared to, say, an ancient empire or a different contemporary system. The concept of rapid breakdown in the collapse phase, for instance, it might manifest very differently or perhaps be significantly mitigated in societies with strong institutional resilience, deeply embedded civil liberties, and a long tradition of peaceful political transition. Furthermore, the speaker themselves encourages students and us to evaluate the model by whether its predictions align with reality, not just personal beliefs. And they also note that understanding how societies function and fail gives us tools to build better ones. Now, this is a crucial point for me. It suggests that even within this powerful theoretical framework, there's room for agency, for collective action, and for the possibility of altering predicted outcomes. It implies that decline isn't necessarily a predetermined, unalterable path, but rather a trajectory that human choices and societal adaptation can potentially influence. The framework offers a diagnosis, a powerful one, but perhaps not an immutable prognosis.
Okay, to conclude then, the 3 phases of societal evolution, I believe, offers an incisive and genuinely compelling framework for understanding the trajectory of societies and critically how it applies to the West today. The defining characteristics of the decline phase, things like the emergence of bureaucracy prioritizing itself over progress, the replacement of genuine consent with various forms of deception, and this prevailing societal focus on mere stability rather than growth, these are not abstract concepts. They are, I argue, demonstrably present and increasingly pronounced in Western nations. These profound shifts provide a robust foundation for the framework's 5 bold predictions, and I contend these are not merely speculative. They represent logical and, frankly, quite alarming consequences of a society undergoing significant structural decline. A model's real power, I think, lies in its dispassionate focus on underlying power dynamics, urging us to evaluate its predictions against unfolding reality, rather than relying on perhaps idealistic notions of what our societies should be. The analysis really compels us to seriously consider that the West is indeed navigating a significant systemic shift towards decline, with these specific predictions serving as critical markers, perhaps even warnings of this transition.
And in summary, from my perspective, while the 3 phases of societal evolution framework provides an exceptionally valuable and certainly thought-provoking contribution to our understanding of societal dynamics, and it absolutely encourages essential critical thinking, I believe, its specific and perhaps rather unqualified application to the Western world, particularly the implied immediacy and inevitability of its 5 bold predictions, warrants continued, nuanced evaluation. I maintain that while elements consistent with the decline are certainly visible within our societies, the framework's direct causal links from these general characteristics to a, rapid, inevitable slide into civil conflict, authoritarian rule, or economic collapse might oversimplify the demonstrable resilience, the inherent complexity, and the adaptive capacities that do characterize modern Western societies. This framework serves as an excellent tool for analysis, no doubt. It helps us identify potential vulnerabilities. But the exact unfolding of events, as the speaker themselves notes, remains a working theory, to be rigorously tested against the full, complex tapestry of reality. Ultimately, we're left to consider not just the predictions themselves, but also the potential for alternative pathways, and crucially, the influence of human agency and collective will in shaping societal futures. This ongoing evaluation, this testing of the model's predictive power against real-world developments, is precisely where the true value of this kind of intellectual engagement lies.